I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for. Welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. I'm super excited to have Alicia Miller back as a guest because you have some really exciting news. And we're chatting, and I thought would be a really good time to check in again and have another follow-up conversation. Yeah, because a year ago we were talking about API as a utility, and that has evolved and grown, and there's lots of big news happening on the telco scene.
Yes.
And you have some really interesting personal news because now you're the head of growth strategy at Aduna Global, and that's a really big deal. So welcome back. Maybe if you could do a short introduction of who you are again, and then your role that you've had in Verizon before, and then now this new role that you're stepping into at Aduna. And also, what is Aduna? Maybe we can even start there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll start with what is Aduna. So Aduna is a joint venture among 12 telcos globally and Ericsson that is with the goal to accelerate the telco network API market, which has been around for several years and growing every year. So we had Open Gateway that came out in 2022 and Kamara around the same time that have really been pushing these network APIs, but they didn't solve all of the problems that the industry had around the value of these APIs is that the developer, it's better for the developer when they have access to the same API or set of APIs across enough telcos within a market, but also across markets. You've got to give reasons to those telcos to develop and commercialize those APIs, which is here's what developers want. Here's how I know that. I'm out and talking to these developers. And oh, by the way, I'm going to make it easy for them to consume these by doing the work of aggregating them and then making that aggregated product available at a low margin. So that's what Aduna is here to do. It's here to reduce the friction in getting telcos to commercialize those APIs that developers want, and then making them easy for developers to consume.
I had heard about the joint venture, and it was like big news in the telco sector.
Yeah.
And and then we were chatting, and then turns out that you actually got offered a job.
Yeah. Yes.
Can you tell a little bit about what role you're going to be playing and how did you got there?
Yeah. So I'm going to be, or as of Monday next week, and 1 week from today that we're recording this, I will be head of growth strategy at Aduna, which is a pretty cross-functional place. It fills in the gaps between the sales and business development and technology and product and all of those things that need to be done in order to actually commercialize and launch. And I'll be reporting to Peter Arbiter, who is the chief commercial officer. So he owns all the sales and the supply and the business development and the marketing. And so I'll own things like pricing and API roadmap, which comes with market research. You have to know which APIs developers want to plan your roadmap. And then solving kind of industry-wide things like consent and ASP onboarding. So those are the initial pieces that I'll be tackling and very cross-functional. And then I came into the role because I had spent the last maybe year and a half, a little over a year and a half, leading the JV participation efforts from within Verizon. And so I got to know all of those different players. And then when this role came up, I jumped at the chance.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's like all the really juicy, interesting parts of the whole strategy. It's really cool. I'm really excited. Yeah. For people that are listening that are not so familiar with the telco sector, can you maybe give a little bit of a bird's eye view of all the different players that are in this ecosystem? Because it's a fascinating ecosystem that is, I think, actually pretty mature and also
new at the same time.
Yes, exactly. It's actually the whole API as a product movement started with one of the aggregators from the telco sector, or they were really one of the front runners. But can you maybe just explain a little bit about how does this sector work and what is actually the complexity of it?
Yeah, and I think when people think about telco APIs, they think about the traditional CPaaS or communication platform as a service, like SMS and everything that comes along with SMS or calling or the 5-digit or 10 DLC. This is not CPaaS. These are very clearly things that are outside of CPaaS. So the APIs are things like number verification or SIM swap, the first two that are being launched, which is, okay, is this phone number, I'm going to tell you, telco, the phone number that the user told me, can you just tell me, is this the one that they're actually on right now? Yes or no? So things like that. So this is not, I want to send a text message and then I want to run a communications campaign. This is give me that kind of information on the device, or I want to track my IoT device with location. So these are the types of APIs that we're talking about. But the ecosystem, interestingly, is like most of the same players that have been involved in CPaaS, these new APIs require a little bit of a mindset shift. So you've got the aggregators that you've had, like you think of Twilio in the US, you think of Infobip and Cinch and some other markets. And these are traditionally CPaaS aggregators, but they're getting into this network API space as well. So you've got those aggregators. Obviously, you have the telcos who have the information and the capabilities that the APIs are using, integral part. You've got hyperscalers, which are a part of it. They've got their hyperscaler marketplaces. They also have their own kind of developer marketplaces in addition. So Google Firebase would be an example of that. And then you've got developers of all shapes and sizes. So like Uber is an application, right? You might think of like they're really big. And then you have all the small applications that in the Play Store and the Apple App Store, thousands, millions, I don't know how many there are, but all of those as well are kind of ecosystem players in all of this. And then, of course, you have our favorite, the regulators in each country, but we'll leave them to the side for now.
And then also developer community, because a lot of people always think about like applications and then purely what you get on your phone, but there's also a whole big group of developers in the enterprise space that are also slightly different.
Absolutely. And a lot of them, so I think IoT is a good example of these. There's financial institutions, which may be the most obvious, the number verification and SIM swap, right? You've got your banking mobile app, but you've also got, you're logging on a computer and they want to make sure that you are who you say you are and you're their customer and accessing your own account and not someone else. But also in IoT, think about any IoT platform developer or device manufacturer. They all use APIs and they're very tied into cellular connectivity as well in one form or another. So these are also the enterprise players that we're talking about. But to me, it's a subset of the application developers. They're all application developers, but every application developer might have different needs, or a different sector is going to have a different need than a different sector. And the size obviously is going to make a difference as well. And not only the size, but also how sophisticated they are. Are they just getting started, or have they been using APIs for decades? All of them have different needs.
So in this landscape, so there's all these players and all play like their own different roles. What was really the need for Aduna in this whole ecosystem? What is it that you're bringing in that wasn't there before?
Yeah. So I talked about Open Gateway, which is a GSMA initiative. So the largest telco industry organization, GSMA. Their Open Gateway initiative is trying to solve a lot of those business friction problems, and as well as some of the technical standardization, lowercase s issues as well. So things like creating a use case library, creating a standardized agreement template for telcos to use with channel partners, for instance. And these are all great because they help the vast majority of telcos out there, like helping everyone in the industry come along. But it's at that more basic level. And also GSMA can't commercialize. Right? They can't go and sell these things. So they can help the industry and solve some of those information sharing and collective action problems, obviously within an antitrust framework, but they can't go all the way. And then Kamara, Linux Foundation project, is where all of the APIs are being developed. The specifications themselves are being developed. But again, Kamara is not going to commercialize the APIs, but it is where everyone's solving those problems of how does one telco make their network work with another telco in terms of what these specifications are, because every telco network is set up differently. But again, none of them are commercializing anything. And without that commercialization aspect, you cannot create that critical mass of, like I mentioned earlier, that same API being available across enough telcos. So you really need to hit 80% of the population in a country for it to become valuable to a developer. For like, we're talking B2C applications here. For a developer, they really need 80% minimum. And so Kamara wasn't going to be able to solve that problem. GSMA tried to solve that problem with the Market Champion Initiative and Open Gateway, which is really helpful, but I think just showcases maybe one API that is more around we can create it and there is some demand, but every country is on a different timeline with it. So where Aduna comes in is Aduna is bringing that commercial information, that demand information. Aduna is bringing those customers. Aduna is bringing the aggregators, Vonage, Infobit, Cinch. Aduna is bringing those hyperscalers along as well. Aduna is having conversations with large digital natives to say, okay, we've got these APIs. And oh, by the way, we're not going to price gouge you. And changing this value equation of where the value actually sits and saying, okay, I'm going to do the work of the aggregation and I'm only going to take a 15% margin on it. Now we open the doors a little bit more. We allow more people access to this information and to these capabilities than previously. And we can solve that problem of that critical mass, both within a country and across countries, because we're bringing that hard demand information. That is what's helping telcos make their own economic decisions about what APIs they're going to commercialize.
So basically, you're a bootstrapping catalyst to help the market to shape and to grow, and
yes.
and strategically where aggregators started from, like they started with aggregation. I think they started with developer experience first. I think that was their initial positioning that they were taking, and then they became the aggregators that had deliverability across the globe. That now potentially not the developer experience, but the aggregation and the network completeness is where you're going to be playing a role. Is that or increasing network completeness through a different pricing model? Is that a good characterization of the strategic position Aduna is taking?
When you say network completeness, are you talking about the critical mass?
Or it's like, how many players are there in? So for me, this sounds a lot like the Visa problem, with a multi-sided market with lots and lots of players. That is really hard to pull off because you need everybody to like be pulling in the same direction.
Yeah.
And these super large networks, they fall or stand by having everybody sitting at the same table and everybody joining the initiative. Now, it's a classical economy of scope problem. It's like the more people use the same interfaces, the more valuable they become.
Yeah. It's I'm trying to remember the word a network.
For sure. Yeah.
It leads to that critical mass of users as well that any sort of social network platform uses. Facebook, everyone's on it, so it becomes easier. But when no one's on it, then yeah. But so I think Aduna is solving that problem. You've got a lot of actors that would otherwise be taking different actions because they're based on different beliefs or different sources of information, or they can't solve all those problems themselves either. If you're a user in Germany, for instance, you also need the MVNOs because it's just the MNOs in Germany. You're not even reaching half the population. But that's not a problem that the telcos alone can solve. There has to be a business in the middle that can actually commercialize the APIs and work with all of the different players in there to say, here's the APIs that we're going to commercialize. We're going to take care of bringing the customers as well.
And it's the exact same problem that like the credit card companies ran into, is when they tried to set up their network. There were some similar problems. There were the two sides to start, but then also the antitrust challenges to overcome. And right now we have two major players globally, basically.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, there's a few more, but there's I think there's a little bit of growth in it, but yeah, these two really large dominant players, or at least in Europe, I get two choices. That's basically which one of these two do you want? And then and I was like, wow, is there any difference? Like, no, it's the same. Just and then at a random moment, my bank sends me like a different card, and they've switched me over to the other provider. Like, what happened here? Well, I don't know, but that's the experience that I have there. But the real value of those networks was that they enabled digital transactions. And that was a massive infrastructure layer that enabled all of e-commerce. And then where I was reading this article about how people used to think about credit cards. And it's actually not that long ago that credit cards actually had a stigma. And people were like, oh, you buy stuff on credit? You don't have money? Or what's wrong with you? And that going against this and like changing the minds, how people think about this, like a really important aspect. So it feels a bit like Europe, this is something similar that you're doing in like creating a standard that wasn't there before.
Yeah.
Well, standard is there, but how the standard actually works, that is still missing. And it's very fascinating.
Yeah, because also Kamar is creating the specifications, but not the code behind it as well. So yes, every telco's got its own specifications, but somebody else has to then take those and actually put it into an application. And that's not as standardized across the industry as well. So something, again, that Aduna is doing or helping the aggregators and others to do is, again, just make it easier for developers to have access to this information.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? Because we talked a little bit about this, that last year I asked you about, you and Joshua, what do you think about APIs as utilities? Because back then I was very busy about this progression that's dictated, or that is, if you're doing a lot of Wardley mapping, there's progression from something as a initial playground to a custom solution to products to ultimately commodity and utility. And where we had this conversation about, we talk in the API world always about APIs as products, but actually this is not the end station. There's APIs as utilities and APIs as commodities that comes after this. And I've had, also after our conversation, I've had several conversations where people, especially API product owners, get really uncomfortable about that because they're like, I got my company to invest a lot of money into products, and now you're talking about this becoming a commodity. What the hell are you talking about? So how has your thinking evolved since last year about this?
So I think that I have looked at the word utility differently. So I also had that kind of reaction. I was like, oh my God, well, these can't be commodities because we're just launching them now. Why would we launch a commodity, like a product that's already a commodity? Which you can make money off of those. That's fine. It's just a lot less exciting. But these may turn into commodities, but only because people forget how hard it was to get here in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think that's one, is that the complexity of this business is underestimated. This is not sending an SMS. There are way more regulations that come along with these types of APIs. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them. For the informational ones especially, that we haven't done before, or we did, but are still really hard to solve, and then are also really hard to solve not only just with one telco, but then you may have different interpretations of the same law across 3 telcos in one country, or you may have different laws across countries, right? We think it's GDPR and the US's many state privacy laws, right? These are not the same frameworks, and just trying to mesh across those is really hard. And I think that's overlooked. And so these, shouldn't be thought of as commodities because it's actually really hard to do. And so I think there's just inherently a lot of value in that. That's my own personal opinion about it. But also I think the utility piece is different. I think so. When I think of utility, it's probably a really niche example, but I play the cello, and I have played the cello for a very long time, most of my life. And at some point as a musician, you end up having to record music, or you end up having to download Sibelius, which no one likes, and write music, or do an arrangement. You have only a trio and you really liked this quartet, so now you want to arrange it as a trio. And I think of those as utilities, but man, are they important. Yeah. And super useful. And okay, so do I take the voice recorder on my phone for granted? Yeah, because my phone already has a microphone and it's like part of the core function of a phone. But I think that voice recorder is a utility, but it doesn't make it any less important just because it's a utility. And I think that's actually the crux of it. So if your phone didn't have a voice recorder and you couldn't ever get one, would you buy that phone? I don't know. Maybe it's not the only thing that you would base your decision off of, but I bet it would be in there. Or the famous example of that is the cup holder in a car. You probably wouldn't buy a car if it didn't have a cup holder or you couldn't figure out how to create one in there. Yeah. Small little tiny thing that is actually not even at all related to a car's core function of getting you from point A to point B, but like super important and a utility within the car. So I think I'm thinking of utility as different. And the more important something is, the better off the provider of that thing is. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for an API to be a utility. It's what you do with it and how you look at it and how you commercialize it that is then going to make the difference.
And I think the key is in the complexity, as you said. So if you need to solve a really complex problem, then there's a lot of value, even if the end result is a global product with a global reach, where everybody is using the same thing.
Yeah. And by the way, if it seems easy to everyone to use, then Aduna's done a really good job of hiding all of that complexity.
Yes. It's like electricity. Electricity today, electricity had become very boring. But now, like in Belgium, because we have so many solar panels now, actually electricity is becoming a rather complex problem yet again. Because there's overcapacity during the daytime or like on sunny days. And then it's a press, probably blowing it up a little bit too much, but talking about maybe we're going to have to decouple parts of the network because there's too much electricity. And that's okay. Yeah. So there's now an opportunity for someone to step into the electricity world and become the one who solves that complexity, helps to address the complexity and to create a lot of value with that. And actually value shifting from the production, or at least during the daytime, from the people that are producing to the people that are coordinating and that are facilitating that coordination. So I think, you're right. And same with credit cards. They are the utmost utility, or one of the biggest utilities in the world, and they make a lot of money doing that utility.
Yeah. So I don't think I think my thinking on it has evolved since the last time we talked about it. And now I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing, but that the value is shifting. And I value these network APIs, their presence alone shifts the value equation from what it has been traditionally in CPaaS to something new. And getting the CPaaS providers to think about it in a different way has been interesting, because traditionally the value has been in aggregation because that's been the difficult part. Yeah. The aggregation itself is actually a lot easier now because every telco has the same set of specifications. So the aggregation becomes less important and the value add becomes in everything else, all the L3 and layer 3 and layer 4 services on top of those APIs. But also the value is in coordinating with the telcos, which coming directly from one, I know firsthand how hard it is. And I think that anyone who's dealt with the telco is like, I know how hard it is. That's fine. But this is still another level of complexity that does not exist in the CPaaS space today.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it'll be really interesting to see how does it evolve? Like 1 year later, what will have happened? How does the market mature? How is that right now, actually? Like how much reach do these new standards? Does Camara already have some adoption, or how is it
there's I would say Camara has pretty widespread adoption in a lot of markets. Most telcos are participating. Like Camara has also removed pretty much every barrier to participation. You don't have to be a paying member of Camara to participate in the specification development, nor to use those specifications either. If you want to pay, you can. There's different levels of membership based on organization size that makes it attainable if that's what you wanted to do. But it's been someone that was very recently on the board of Camara. I'm obviously very proud of it and the work that it does. And so, yes, I think Camara does have really wide reach, and it is the only true standardized set of specification creation for these APIs. TMF is certainly playing a role. MEF is also playing a role. Open Gateway, GSMA is playing a role as well in standardized APIs, but not in the same APIs that Kamara is making.
And how is the adoption from developers? How is that evolving?
I think it's early stages. You'll see proofs of concept here and there. Most of the telcos have a developer portal where you can do some level of trialing. It looks different everywhere, but you can do some level of trialing with the APIs. So we're seeing it. There was a hackathon also in Barcelona with these APIs that GSMA was helping push as well. So I think it's really early stages, but we are still getting good feedback from the ones that we are doing trials with who are using it. There seems to be a lot of interest in it. I think, and also my perspective is primarily like Brazil and US and a little bit of Europe, but in Brazil, for instance, they're commercially launched with an aggregator. I think it's Infobip. With the financial institutions, like some of the major banks, they're using these APIs. So it's different paces in different markets, but it is getting there. And I think once it is available on Aduna, and especially through the aggregators themselves, hopefully we'll see a lot more uptick.
So what are like the gnarly problems? So the one is like just getting everybody on board. I imagine consent management is
a gnarly problem because it's different in every country or jurisdiction, and it's different in ways that make it difficult to implement. So it's different in, what gets presented to the end user? There's requirements that differ in each market to the end user. The hardest part is the coordination, the understanding the regulations, all of the logic that would trigger the consent to look one way or another based on where you are. Also. So all of that's definitely a gnarly problem. ISV or ASP onboarding is another one of those. So it's very important to the telcos to make sure that whoever has access to this information is trustworthy, right? Yeah. So not everyone can just get access. You can't just say, I'm going to start an app today, and as part of my app, I want to use number verification. And so I'm just going to use it and I'm going to sign up and I'm going to pay, and that's that. You have to go through a vetting process. What does that vetting process look like? Who does it? How long does it take? What information is required? How do we gather that information? All of that. And there are standards so TMF is creating some of those API standards to help different gateways talk to one another, including this onboarding piece and information gathering for that onboarding. But just because the standardization exists or the specification doesn't mean that the implementation is clear. Yeah. And so that's another gnarly problem that Aduna can solve for the industry in a way that's going to be more efficient than every telco doing it themselves.
Yeah, talking a little bit about developer relations and so you were talking about hackathons, like that was Kamara or GSMA that was organized?
That was a GSMA hackathon. I think Nokia was a big sponsor of it.
Are there other people that are doing developer relations in that market or that are working on building the market or?
Yeah, that's definitely also one I would categorize that as a gnarly problem as well, because the developer relations is being done in different ways today, but not with these products. And because these are new, there's a different type of developer relations that has to be done. You have to teach people that this exists, and then what does it do and the value to them. And each API is different. It's not the same value for every single API. Just because we love to say, oh, we've got telco network APIs. Okay, but like a number verification API is really different from a location verification IoT API, or very different from tell me on a scale of 1 to 5 how good network coverage is at this location. Really different use cases for these, or QoD, very different use cases across all of these, but they're like lumped together as a telco network API. But you're not going to market them the same way, and you're not going to market them to all the same people. So I think that makes developer relations more difficult in this context, because it's not like, oh, I've got Salesforce and I want to teach you all the APIs for Salesforce. This is, I've got a telco network and I'm going to teach you all the APIs for a telco network. Well, that's very wide ranging. That's very wide ranging. And so that's, I think, one of the harder pieces of it. So having every player in the ecosystem do a little bit of developer relations is going to be key to this. And then also making sure that we're all saying similar messages, or at least that we're not contradicting one another, or that if we are, that we resolve that conflict and that contradiction pretty quickly. So we need the aggregators to do DevRel. We need the hyperscalers to do DevRel. Aduna needs to do some amount. Kamara needs to continue doing what it's doing. Each of the telcos has to continue engaging in some form or fashion, and everyone's going to do a little bit of it. I'm hoping to create a lovely, and use another musical thing here, a lovely symphony of DevRel.
That's interesting, because basically these APIs are like a bag of affordances, and each of them have their own market. Mm-hmm. And like, that's a really interesting perspective I hadn't thought about. And then, the question is like, how much can you really have DevRels for the whole bag? Yeah. Talking about all of them together, or should this actually be separate initiatives that need to happen? Just to help people understand what can you actually do with this stuff. Right. And
So there's a conference going on this week, NAB, I know I'm going to get the acronym wrong, so I'm not going to try to do it, but it's the media entertainment space. It's broadcasting. And there is a place for telco APIs there. Telcos show up, Verizon's there. There's a place for telco APIs at that type of conference. But it's not every single API that a telco has that's going to be relevant there. And you can't just say, I've got this API and here's what it does. You have to talk about the value and the value to the customer for that API. And then you're going to go maybe talk to customers at the NAB conference, and maybe some of them actually really do care about number verification because they all have accounts, right? Like Adobe has user accounts, and they want to make sure that for instance, their users are the ones logging in. But the number verification is also highly relevant to like maybe the RSA security conference. But you're going to be talking about them in different ways at each of those conferences, and you're going to be talking to vastly different customers at those conferences. And so those are the things that we are thinking about and it's not really DevRel, it's like marketing, but DevRel is certainly a part of marketing. And how do you talk to different customers about those different APIs based on what they care about?
Yeah, and and there's so many geographies and so many industries. Mm-hmm. Now it's like some contextualized version of this.
Yes.
That's a huge problem.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's. I wonder if you could, what kind of community you have to set up for that, and how.
Yeah, or communities, plural.
Or communities, yeah, or like a community of communities, and who pays for that work? Because that's the other part.
Right.
Because I think it's better if you're coordinating this work than if you're doing it in isolation.
Yep.
Nobody alone wants to pay for this. And then maybe you could have like specialists looking at certain affordances that can you do a coral reef approach where you create lots of small ecosystem niches where one person's waste product is another person or is another company's strength, so that you can take this really large global market. I think this is something that's been very close to my heart. I've been thinking a lot about this because of the Drupal ecosystem that we're part of with our content management, because we use Drupal, which is a content management system, open source content management system. And there in the community, we're talking about building a marketplace. And I've been thinking a lot about how do we do this in a healthy way, and what is a healthy way? And then I started thinking about this. There was an article I read last week about coral reefs, which was explaining how coral reefs grow in like nutrient deserts in the middle of the ocean where there's almost very little nutrients. And then you have these organisms that are starting to build all of these little nooks and crannies that suddenly provide shelter places for fishes. And then this mechanism is started where you're building out very complex, like a very large surface. So you take this three-dimensional space where there's a lot of space, but there's very little surface, and where it's actually dangerous to be as a little fish because a shark comes around and you're gone. But if you have this very intricate coral surface that creates these different little niches where there's different circumstances, different nutrient gradients, more or less proximity of different things that take this flat space that's really inhospitable to life, and it turns it into a place where a lot of diverse ecosystems can emerge. So how do you do something like that? And how do you facilitate that?
Yeah. And I think that is the problem of the full ecosystem. Like you said, there's no one owner for that problem. There's no one organization that's going to solve that problem. And that's why having GSMA's Open Gateway and Kamara and Aduna and whatever other fora there are for these conversations and for these actions, for people to take these actions, that's all going to contribute to the coral reef or the symphony. And it's all going to contribute its own part. And I described when we were building the JV as, like, to people who would ask, I described it as the best group project I've ever been on because everyone did their part. There wasn't that one person sitting in the corner doing nothing but getting dragged along anyway, and then everyone was doing their part. And I think that has to remain true in this. You can't have the one kind of person that's just along for the ride. Everyone's got to chip in.
But then you get the tragedy of the commons, like where late entrants come in and they're like, oh, thank you very much for all this work you've done. I think that the unique positions are just like a coral reef, where it doesn't really need the ecosystem necessarily. It's like the ecosystem is a byproduct because it's just doing its thing. It's growing towards the light. And there's all these filter animals just building up calcium skeletons. Right. And I think most of the best ecosystems are like that, where there's a lot out of self-interest, a lot of commercial services being created. And yet there is enough, in one dimension, it's very similar so that it becomes, so that it can scale. But then in some other dimension, there's lots of nooks and crannies. Yeah.
And I think if I were to oversimplify the metaphor, I would say it's organic growth. Right. Yes. It's driven out of necessity. Someone needs something, so they're going to build it, but they don't just build it for themselves. Everyone can share it and build on top of it. And so these APIs are open source, right? Yeah. Kamara is completely open source. It's all on GitHub with certain exceptions of some more security sensitive APIs, but fine. The rest of it is open source. And I think that is the challenge that's the golden, the gold standard that everyone wants to get to, is where that organic growth does happen. And I don't think anyone actually knows how to get there. I think people who have done it, some people like to say, here's the recipe, but I don't think that's true. It's not the same in every industry, right? There is no recipe for it. And you just have to hope that you've created the right environment for it to happen and you've provided the right tools. And I think a lot of it does also come down to imagination. You're helping people to imagine the possibility, but they need enough information for their imaginations to start taking over. You need a foundation. You need some kind of, what's your premise? Is the floor green or red? You need somewhere to start. And I'm hoping that is what each of the industry is currently providing today to those people who are going to imagine what's coming next and going to imagine what coral reef they can build or what little piece of the coral reef that they can build.
There was one of my favorite books is Out of Control by Kevin Kelly. And he talks about all these, a number of these ecosystem mechanisms or patterns that we can see in the biological world. I hope it's this one. It's definitely Kevin Kelly, but it might be another book. So it's definitely Kevin Kelly, and I think it's Out of Control because there's a couple of books that I also really loved. But he talks about scaffolding species, which is, there was this one island where they cut down all the cedar trees and because they wanted to build ships. And then that was a problem because there was, I think, a bird that was nesting under the cedar trees that would tip just a little bit so that there would be a place under their roots that bird could live. So they tried to plant new cedar trees in this island, but then a large storm would come and it would just wipe out everything. So what they figured was that they had to plant another species of tree that was not there when they cut the wood, but they needed to put this tree in there that was going to hold the wind enough until the cedar trees could grow big enough and withstand the wind. And so there's this time-dependent path. There's a unique path that you need to walk. And the next time that you try to do the same thing, it actually might not be available to you because you don't have the exact same context or the right mix of species that is doing this. So it's a very interesting problem.
Yeah, sometimes you get those gale force winds and sometimes you don't.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
And sometimes they're blowing in your favor and sometimes they're not. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then being able to adapt to whatever wind is blowing right now so that you can always keep adapting the strategy. You have an amazing job.
I know. I can't wait. I'm really excited to get started. I don't know how I lucked out, but yes. And I think if I can, maybe this part will get cut. We'll see the final podcast. But maybe that's a hint to a conversation on AI and
Yes.
these APIs of what's next and how does AI play into this and how do we imagine that kind of future?
It's a perfect transition because you're right. There's a big tailwind right now in AI, and there's a lot of people looking for ways to make it work. It would be interesting to see how do you see the crossover between APIs, AI, and telcos, and maybe also what have you seen in the last year or two? What are the interesting projects that you've seen evolving on the telco world towards AI adoption? Be that in infrastructure for AI or just using AI inside of telcos.
Yeah. And obviously, I'm only going to talk about what's been publicly announced because having just last week been at Verizon, or just on Friday, really. And I think we've seen telcos in the US at least make announcements around infrastructure for AI. And there's a play around the AI workloads and how the topology of the data flows may change because of AI and where the information gets stored and where it gets sent and what happens, where is the compute versus where is the result sent. There's different places for compute to happen and where does data sit? Where does data reside? Where does it need to get sent to? And so all of that is, telcos are looking at that and seeing how does that play into their networks. But then I think on the other side, there's telcos are using AI. So Verizon uses AI in its customer service centers, been public about that, very specific models to help customer service. So it's being used also within telcos. And in the similar way, I think it's being used in a lot of companies, which is to help its own services become more efficient and allow people to focus on the parts that require thought and not just the process of things or things that are really highly repeatable, but focus on new ways of doing things. So that's what I've seen in telcos. What I don't doubt at all is that the amount of data that's going to be traversing any information network is going to increase. That for sure.
As always. I already see a lot of movements in that direction, like the whole DeepSeek thing. That was about that. The smaller model, I was in Brussels, and I think there were talks about smaller models that you could just run on your phone. I'm just thinking that I'm not saying no. This is becoming more reality. And I think this really heavy inferencing, or there's ways to do lighter inferencing that make those kind of things possible, and that makes a lot more sense. Also from a data security perspective. I don't know if you'll be sending all your personal data over the network to do some inferencing in one. So even just there's already a lot of interesting problems you don't want to have.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's evolving really fast. So I think these really huge investments that are being made by the hyperscalers, billions and billions. I think it makes sense for them because they're really in a pole position. But it's the traditional hyperscaler playbook. You start with something really cheap and then get everybody to start using it. And then afterwards after everybody has already...
After it's become a utility, maybe.
Exactly. Actually, yes.
Bringing it full circle.
Yes. Yeah.
After you can't live without it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the new definition of utility, something you can't live without.
It's interesting.
Or you could, but it would be extremely difficult.
Yeah. And it's also, there's so much stuff built on top of it that it destroys a whole chunk of your ecosystem if you pull it out. And that is definitely happening with LLM, with large language models now, that are being worked into a whole bunch of different solutions. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Always fun.
Great pleasure. And we should definitely do another check-in a little bit later once things are
settled.
Yeah. just to see like how is it evolving? What is the complexity that can be your complexity engine in your job, or your complexity value engine. That's because I think that's the coolest part about complexities, because it's always changing. You have to keep on adapting. So if you're in the right place to be the one who's the best at adapting, you have infinite value.
I would ask all the strategy nerds out there, is that a true strategic moat, your ability to adapt to complexity? So, the hardcore ones are going to say no, but I think there's an argument to be made.
I've been thinking about this, because in essence, you're learning how to adapt. And not only you're not learning how to adapt, you're also learning how to learn how to adapt. And it's like the second order stuff that's really hard. So like you could, like it's like Google, like Maps, for example. Once you have OpenStreetMap that is externalizing a map of the whole world, or that is making a map of the whole world available, like then the value shifts. It's like what you said earlier, that once there's a common standard and enough players have started standardizing on the same sets of APIs, the value shifts from being the one who can give you full coverage of the world to something else again.
Yeah.
But I think that, I'm not sure if they're like fully unovercomable modes, but they're pretty steep curves at least. Like to be able to give a good routing service, like for GPS, you need to have a lot of customers already, because that's how you know where there's a lot of traffic and where there's no traffic. There's been some break-ins in that market. You can see some players step into that, like after maps had been commoditized. But yeah, because that's actually what OpenStreetMap did, is commoditize a map, to truly commoditize it. But it's an interesting question. Next time, but is that a defensible moat? Is that a true moat or not?
Yeah.
Or how do you make it a true moat? Right. Thank you very much, Alicia.
Thank you. This was fun.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com, and thank you for listening.